Hey guys, Paul with Weapons of the World here, and have a special guest, 29 Marine here.
Yep.
And today we're going to be talking about the good old M1 Garand, the U.S. service rifle for both the Army and the Marine Corps for the duration of World War II and afterwards into the Korean War, and even sometimes in the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
Small numbers were used, but some basic information about the rifle. It fired the 30-06. Some numbers were actually made in 7.62 by 51 NATO later on. Uh, that was mostly used by the Navy. It's gas operated, piston driven. It's got a rate of fire of about 40 to 50 rounds a minute. Muzzle velocity is 2,800 feet per second, pretty standard out of a 30-06. Effective range is about 500 yards. The clip, and this is an actual clip, it's called an end block clip, uh, holds 8 rounds, and it's fed internally. So you actually put it in the rifle instead of like a magazine, or say like on a Mosin, you have a stripper clip. So yeah, that's a basic stats on it. I don't know if
Speaking
you've
of
ever.
the clip, real quick before you move on, I actually, when I was in 29 Palms, we're out in the field, just out in the middle of the desert, and we're actually in an area there called Blacktop, which is like as far as you can get away from main side in 29 Palms. It's like a 2.5 hour drive through the desert. And we were sleeping. We're getting ready. We're setting up our sleeping bags, getting ready to sleep, and there was something jabbing me in the back, and I'm like, "What the hell is this?" And I thought it was a rock, so I kind of reached under my bag and my sleeping bag and was trying to find it, and I felt something metal. And out there, it's very unwise to touch anything metal unless you know for sure what it is, because there's a lot of unexploded ordnance out there. And so I jumped up and I pulled my sleeping bag back, and I turned my flashlight on, and it ended up being a clip for an M1 from, I imagine, when the Marines were out there training, or whoever was out there training, because I don't even think the Marine Corps had that base. I think it was the Army at that point. But an old rusted clip for an M1. And I still have it,
Dang,
actually, here somewhere. I got to find it.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
So while we're on the topic of clips, after the 8 rounds were fired, as everyone knows, the bolt would move rearward and lock, and the clip, excuse me, would be ejected, making the distinct ping.
Hmm.
Everyone knows that sound, very iconic. I've heard both sides of the argument that the Germans or the Japanese would hear the ping and get up and start shooting. So the GIs or the Marines would throw down their empty clips on a rock and make the same ping noise,
Yep.
and then they'd shoot them when they pop up. But I've also heard that, when there's so much gunfire going around, anybody who shot a gun in their entire life knows how loud guns are. They're very loud. So you couldn't really hear the ping. And I've heard both sides. I'm torn as to what exactly which one is true.
Well, I can, and obviously the firefights these guys were in were a lot crazier than
Oh
my
yeah.
story here. But we were out shooting, and my buddy that I was just telling you about before we started, he had his M1, and we were shooting. They had an M60, we had an AK, we had a couple ARs, and then some just weird ass rifles that people had. And we were all just kind of doing just kind of emptying out the rest of our ammunition, just
Yeah.
downrange. And I was about 4 people away from him, from the guy with the M1. And when he ran, when his clip went dry and he ejected it, you could hear it, even with
Mm.
all this other stuff going off. And which I thought was weird. Like it didn't really register at the time, but I remember hearing the, kind of that clang or the ping noise, whatever you want to call it. Which I don't know how
Interesting.
close, obviously, like the Japanese or the Germans would have had to have been to hear that, but I can say that it is certainly loud enough where
Possible
you
to
can hear
hear.
it if you're listening for it.
Huh, that's pretty interesting. Huh.
And because I've heard the same things, and there's quite a few books that guys, especially Marines, it seems, at least the ones I've read, on the same thing where the Japanese would intentionally wait until they heard several of those go off, at the same time,
Yeah.
before they really kind of leapt up and started firing.
Yeah. Hmm. That's pretty interesting. So a little bit more on the history of the M1. It was designed by, oh, how do you pronounce his name?
I just saw it too.
John Garand. So it's John Garand. I'm not gonna even. Yeah, so John Garand. He was actually born in Canada, and the first model of the M1 that he produced was actually in a caliber called 276. But the U.S. Army didn't want anything to do with that caliber, so they had him change it to 30-06 to shorten up that story, because that could be a whole other video.
Oh, I didn't realize he had made it in a different caliber initially.
Yeah, the 276 rifle caliber. I'm not sure exactly how well that round actually worked. I've never seen one, but it's smaller than the 30-06, because you could, in the original with that 276 caliber, you could hold 10 rounds instead of 8. So
Oh,
that's
yeah.
kind of interesting to think of a M1 with 10 rounds. I don't know. That's probably just with me, but it also had a little bit shorter range of only 400 some odd yards, or 400 meters with that kind of caliber. But then they changed it, in my opinion, for the better to the 30-06. I'd much rather have a little bit of stopping power than a smaller bullet.
Yeah, I agree. Getting 2 more rounds out, it's always
Yeah,
good, but having something that hits just a bit harder, I think, is in the end a little better.
important. Yeah.
Especially if you're as
So,
accurate as a lot of those guys were.
oh yeah, I'm hardly a good shot. Any time that I can actually hit something, I'm happy. So if I could hit somebody once and knock them down, then I'm good with that.
When I think it was there was kind of a different mindset, I think, from the guys that use these weapons, and like the Germans that had their Kar 98 and stuff, because compared to like now, because our rifles, you have, I mean, we tend to load our rifles with 27 rounds, so you're not completely
Hmm.
killing the spring in your
Yeah,
magazines, but it can hold up to 30. And I think in your head, knowing that you have 30 rounds, so you're like, well, like obviously I want to hit the bad guy, but I still have another 29 more if I miss, versus
yeah,
these guys who, you have 8 rounds before you got to try to reload.
make them count.
Exactly. And so you're very more focused on, I think, on hitting your target the first time, and even more so maybe with the Germans and their bolt actions, or the guys that had the 1903 Springfields, because those were used still a little bit as well. So it's like
Oh yeah,
when you're forced to have a lot fewer rounds, you kind of definitely have to make those count.
you know, since you bring up the 1903 Springfield, a kind of interesting little fact is, I don't know if you ever knew this or ever heard this, but Chesty Puller, Marine Corps legend, everyone should know Chesty, actually preferred the 1903 Springfield compared to the M1 Garand.
Mm-hmm.
I think he just felt that it was more, he liked it more just because he was used to the rifle. He carried it literally his entire Marine Corps career.
Yeah, I mean, he used it to great effect in in Haiti and in Nicaragua when he was fighting against the guerrillas down there,
Hmm.
and that's where he actually earned, I believe, 2 of his Navy Crosses. I
Yeah.
want to say it was 2 of them down there, and yeah, but he was kind of a very very old school mentality with a lot of his stuff,
Uh-huh.
and he loved the 1903, and it worked well for him, so he saw no reason to to change.
Yeah. That's actually another good video we should do. We should do the 1903 Springfield.
Hell yeah, absolutely, we
Yeah, if
should.
you guys like it, if you guys want that, go ahead and say that in the comments, or if you guys have a gun or anything that you guys want us to talk about, throw that in the comments so we know. But back on the M1, the history. So it was designed at the tail end of World War One. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't get into production in enough time to actually be used in World War One. But the Army still wanted it, so they adopted it. And I'm paraphrasing this because this could all be a whole. There's books on this history of this rifle.
Yeah, you could go on
So
for
it was
hours.
from World War II all the way up to, in small numbers, Vietnam for
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. These things actually pop up in conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen pictures of them using them in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're beat up, but they still work. And even in Africa, I've seen some pop up.
Mm-hmm.
But for the U.S., they used them all the way up into Vietnam, and in Vietnam and Korea, and even some in World War II. They would put on a scope, and I believe that was the M1D.
Yeah, I was looking. There's a few variations. There's like the M1C, the M1D, and I think it just varies on which scope they use and if they had a rear sight protector or
Yeah.
not. Oh,
Yeah,
so
a little
the
note on that.
M1C had the M84 telescope and then the rear sight protector, and the M1D had the M84 telescope and the T37 flash suppressor.
Yeah. A little note with that kind of conversion from a traditional, infantryman's rifle to a designated marksman's rifle or sniper rifle in some cases. It was not exactly the most effective weapon for the job. When you have weapons like, especially in Vietnam, the Remington 700 compared to say like an M1, the M1 just doesn't stack up. It did its job well, but there were much better options. But the Army and the Marine Corps just didn't want to spend the money on, say, like
Yeah.
a Remington 700, which was at the time a civilian hunting rifle, so it was it's expensive compared to say like a
Yeah.
already produced M1.
Well, and I mean, to be fair, too, in the vast majority of fighting in Europe and in the Pacific, there wasn't necessarily the need for super long distance rifles.
Hmm.
The vast majority of the combat was, I would say, within 300 meters
Yep.
in most cases, um, which the M1 can easily hit. If you're
Oh
a
yeah.
decent of a shot. But like you said, there were a lot of other options, but they're expensive, and the military will never go the expensive route on stuff.
Nope. But it did its job well, and when it was finally retired and replaced by the M14, which was basically a M1 with a magazine of 20 rounds,
Yeah.
fully automatic capability, and firing the, you know, 7.62 by 51. It it did its job well when its time was served, and it's a good rifle. If anybody gets a chance to pick it up, get one. They're great rifles. I wish I had one. I don't have the money for one though, sadly. But during its time of service, it served everyone very well. Even though Chesty Puller he didn't dislike the rifle. He just preferred the 1903.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember his exact quote about it, but reading books on Chesty Puller, there wasn't anything wrong with the M1 that he saw. He just preferred the 1903. So I'm not trying to say that Puller just hated the M1 and just saw that the 1903 was a better rifle. The M1 was a great rifle. It served its time well, but eventually it did, like everything else, just kind of got old and needed to be updated and replaced so it could stay with the time and stay effective.
Yeah,
But even then, it
technology
stayed in
advances.
Vietnam. Yeah, it stayed in Vietnam, and around that time when you had new plastics coming out, like on the M16 and the Remington 700 coming out, it's surprising that it stayed till Vietnam, and that kind of just gives you an idea of how effective that weapon really was.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen several times where we've given an M1 to like an old World War II vet, and their eyes just light up, and it's amazing how well they can use them, even though, they're 80, 90 years old. They
Yeah.
can still lock the bolt back. They use it so much, and ask any World War II vet that actually used one of these in combat, and they'll swear by it. They
Oh
won't
yeah.
want to use anything else. But you're right. When speaking about the plastics and stuff, it makes the weapons lighter. Makes it easier to carry for longer amounts of time, and so things just advance. I mean, they get to the point, and even our the weapons we use now, down the road, they'll get tossed to the wayside, and the new, the latest and greatest will pop up. But the fact that this thing essentially won World War II, fought a war of that scale on two fronts, and was the main weapon for our guys in our military is just incredible.
Oh yeah. It's really amazing. And a little fact I actually just remembered: the M1 was the first semi-automatic rifle that was adopted by any military in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now there were older rifles, like the Soviets had been testing with semi-automatic rifles for
Yeah.
a while now, but they just couldn't get it right. And you could kind of see that with like the SVT 38 and even with the SVT 40. But in a time where bolt action rifles were the norm, to have a semi-automatic rifle was really an amazing thing, especially in that time. Now we're all used to our ARs, AKs, and all this fancy stuff, but when you think about it, it's an amazing piece of engineering that he came up with,
Yeah,
60, 70 years ago.
and it gave us such a huge advantage over the Germans and the Japanese because they were using their the main battle rifle they had were all bolt action, and
Yep.
and and they were very very good with them, and they could shoot the bolt action rifles better than you or I could. You know, they could fucking rotate that shit or get chamber a new round in no time. But when you go against a guy that can get 8 rounds out in 10 seconds, relatively accurately, there's not a ton you can do against that.
Yeah. Being able to put down accurate fire consistently, you know, it's important. But at the same time, with the bolt action, it kind of makes you want to take more accurate shots. And we were kind of talking about this before filming, but that was a big concern with the military back when we were fighting. In the Mexican-American War, we had the Krag Jorgensen bolt-action rifle, and they were all equipped with German Mausers. Both were bolt-action, but the Krag Jorgensen was slower to load than the Mauser, and that was done on purpose because the government and the military thought if we give our standard troops guns that can shoot fast, they'll shoot fast, and they'll just go through ammo.
And they'll miss.
So they wanted to give them a slower gun. And it ended up costing people their lives because they couldn't fire fast enough effectively. And that's when the M1, that really shows where the M1 comes in handy compared to bolt-action rifles.
Yeah, and it's just a huge... And two, not to get too far off topic, but the fact that the Germans were able to fight as well as they did, with their bolt actions, kind of show how tough of an opponent they were.
Oh yeah.
They just,
and even they had later on in the war, near the end, they had a Gewehr 43. And even that wasn't a very good rifle. It had problems where their parts would literally explode.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That's a big problem. They had a gassing problem, so the pressure would be just so much that the gun would just explode, killing or wounding the person using it. And there are even companies still today that solely make their money off of replacement parts for G43s that people own today. That's how they make their money, and so
I can believe it.
It really isn't as good as a rifle as many people think. And that again just shows how advanced the M1 was for its time. It was a very impressive rifle.
Yep, absolutely. All right. We covered a whole bunch there. Holy crap.
Oh yeah, we covered a ton. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or questions or, have your opinion, go ahead, put it in the comments. So thanks for watching, guys.
Yeah, peace. Hey guys, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. All the links that you need to get in contact with me are down below. Facebook being the best one to contact me. I'm on my phone all the time, so it's just easiest for me to be able to get back to you with your variety of questions that you guys have. And yeah, if you need anything, by all means, hit me up. So please hit that subscribe button so you can keep in tune with future videos. And I'll see you later. Peace.